Let's review some key takeaways from this week's readings and videos related to the emergence of warfare between European powers that drew Native American groups into these various conflicts. We only studied a few of the major conflicts, as there are far more wars and skirmishes we will not get into in this course. But keep in mind that continental rivalries in Europe typically led to warfare in the Americas. As we work through this review, reflect on the ways these wars affected Native American cultures. We'll begin with King Philip's War, an armed conflict from 1675 to 1678 between Native Americans and English colonists in the New England region of North America, along with Native allies to the English. Let's consider the background of this war. By the mid-17th century, the Puritans had established a foothold in New England. There were tense relations with Native Americans. Indian leaders generally viewed colonists as a major threat. In particular, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, the Pecumtuck, and Narragansett expressed alarm as their lands were especially vulnerable to English expansion. Their goal was simple but daunting, and that was to drive the colonists away from the continent. This map is a bit later than the period we are studying, but it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the European presence in North America in 1700. The eastern coast of North America had a substantial presence of European colonies, although it should be noted there were many areas claimed by European powers, as depicted on this map, that were still being contested. It is one thing to claim a territory as your own, but it's quite another to hold it and populate it. Fighting broke out in June 1675 with a Pokanoket raid on the English town of Swansea. This was a small settlement in Plymouth colony. English colonists responded in force. Both the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies sent military expeditions. They targeted and destroyed Mount Hope. This was a Wampanoag community in Rhode Island. The Wampanoag were allies of the Pokanoket, and they were not, however, direct participants in the raid on Swansea. This, though, widened the conflict by bringing in the Wampanoag and their allies into the war. This close-up map of New England better shows the contested nature of the region. The yellow squares are Indian towns and villages. The black dots are English towns and villages, and you can see there are pockets of each. You can also see the English settlement patterns here, moving westward from the Atlantic coast and moving gradually up the major rivers to start new communities. The Battle of Bloody Brook took place in September 1675. A band of Indians headed by Muttawump ambushed English wagons carrying harvest materials. This battle resulted in the deaths of 60 colonists. This was a substantive wagon train, including 40 militia. Next, we consider the attack on Springfield, which occurred in October 1675. Springfield, Massachusetts, at the time was the largest settlement on the Connecticut River. As you can see from this map, it was also central to many major European settlements. Attacking allies of the Wampanoag quickly destroyed it. They burned nearly all of its buildings before being forced back by colonial forces. And this sent great fear through Europeans in the region because it was kind of the heart of New England at that time. What became known as the Great Swamp Fight took place in November of 1675. Colonial forces attacked the Narragansett. The Narragansett had not been directly involved in the war to this point, but they had sheltered some of the Wampanoag fighters, along with Wampanoag women and children. A few of their warriors individually had participated in some attacks, though, and that was the justification the English used. They put together a military force of 1,000 colonists, along with 200 Indian allies. The Narragansett had retreated to a fort located in a nearby swamp. Several hundred Narragansett, including women and children, were killed in the fighting. The fort was burned to the ground. The Narragansett would never fully recover from this devastation. The surviving Narragansett merged with local tribes, especially the eastern Neontics. Even today, there are only 2,400 Narragansett remaining. And I find this image on the slide to be striking. One of the challenges I face in putting together presentations like this is finding historically accurate images that are also visually appealing, and when possible to find something from the time period itself. The problem with this image is its Eurocentricity. So you see the European soldiers front and center, and you can see how bravely they're going across this wooden tree here, and they're being killed. So they're generating some empathy in the viewer. You can barely see the Native Americans. They're obscured by the swamp plants. You can see a couple of them in the background, but they're mostly hidden by smoke. And if you didn't know the story, you might think Europeans were fighting each other if you just glanced at this image. The Praying Indians were a group of 2,000 Native Americans who had converted to Christianity. They lived in 14 communities supervised by English officials, being instructed on religion and English culture. These peoples, however, suffered greatly from the effects of the war, and it's a real sad story because they had been rather loyal allies to the English. They were forcibly removed from their homes, supposedly for their own protection, but placed in regions where they had not access to food and lacked shelter. Many died from starvation and disease. Some were even sold into slavery in the Caribbean after the war. 1,000 colonists and 3,000 Indians were killed in King Philip's War. As a percentage of population, though, this was one of the deadliest wars in U.S. history. Hundreds of Native Americans were enslaved. This worsened Native and colonist relations for many decades. Many Indian groups became highly antagonistic toward the English after this war. Even groups that were formerly allied with or neutral toward the English began to question their position. England ended the political confederation known as the United Colonies of New England as a result of the war. By 1784, the British were appointing royal governors to oversee New England colonies, and this set a precedent for England to meddle in colonial affairs. Next, let's turn to a conflict known as Queen Anne's War. Again, we have a map of the European colonies in 1700. You can see on the map there were numerous territories in conflict between the European powers. Those are shown with the dashed lines, the regions that were contested. And still more lands were in dispute between European powers and native groups who originally had occupied these lands. There were numerous conflicts that remained unresolved following King Philip's War. In addition, there was a new war. It was called King William's War in the colonies, known as, among other names, the War of the Grand Alliance in Europe. Still no end to the colonial conflicts, and again, wars from Europe we see spilling over to the colonies. In the conflicts in North America, two major groups decided to choose sides here. The Iroquois Confederacy and the Wabanaki Confederacy were drawn into this war, which lasted 9 years. I'm going to note really quickly that students sometimes are confused with spellings, and I apologize if I've used the alternate spelling for the Wabanaki. Sometimes it's spelled A-B-E-N-A-K-I, but they're the same group, just different transliterations of the spelling of their names. The Iroquois sided with the English, and the Wabanaki Confederacy sided with the French. In the south, southern regions of North America, the territorial conflict was mainly between the English colony of Carolina and Spanish Florida. You can add into this mix some Protestant Catholic tensions between the two. In the north, there was a significant border conflict between Acadia, which was a French colony in the maritime provinces of present-day Canada, also parts of present-day Maine, and New England, which was an English colony. The religious conflict was a little less intense in this northern region, but it was still there. The War of Spanish Succession was a European war over who would be the next king of Spain. Without getting sidetracked in a lengthy discussion of European history, I'll whittle this down to the bare bones here. The heir to the Spanish throne, who you see here, Charles II, died without a direct heir. King Louis XIV of France had a claim to the throne via his wife, who, if I recall correctly, was the sister of the now deceased and unfortunate Charles II. The rest of Europe objected, however, to Louis XIV having the crowns of both Spain and France, which would have made France the holder of the vast Spanish colonies around the globe in addition to the French colonies. Charles II was a really unfortunate character. He had significant cognitive and physical disabilities, and he wasn't expected to live very long when he was a small child, but he ended up living to age 35, and so this tension over when he would die and what would happen kind of plagued Spain for decades, but he was the king, and until he passed away, there wasn't much they could do, at least legally. Rivalries between England, France, and Spain fueled this war. The colonial rivalries in North America were especially important. This trade had grown from merely being one based on furs, a fur-based economy, to a much broader range of commodities. The war in Europe again spills over to the Americas. In the Americas, the war was known as Queen Anne's War. She was the British queen at the time, and that's why they tagged the war with her name. In the northern theater, the province of Acadia was especially important. You can see it roughly defined on this map on this page. There was a border conflict between France and Britain, particularly surrounding the French claim to Acadia going all the way down to the Kennebec River, which would have, if you can think of present-day Maine, maybe 2/3 of that area would have been French, and maybe 1/3 of present-day Maine would have remained British. The war begins with some lower-level French and Indian raids on English colonies, which caused the colonists to want to fight. The Northeast Coast Campaign, as it was known, French and Indian forces began targeting and attacking English settlements in a more formal and structured way, highlighted by the Deerfield Massacre, in which almost every person in this English town was killed, which of course sent shockwaves through New England, that not only were the French lurking about and trying to make claims to English colony or English territory, but they had significant backing from local Native Americans. In the southern theater, the importance of the Mississippi River cannot be overstated. This was a time when river travel was the fastest way to move people and commodities, and the Mississippi was the key to control of the entire southeastern chunk of North America. The war began with some initial Spanish and Appalachian attacks, trying to catch the English off guard. The English colonists managed to hold on, and in the Appalachian Massacre, the English orchestrated attacks on Native American villages. They nearly wiped out the Appalachian and Timucua tribes. The Treaty of Utrecht ended the European side of the conflict. The Treaty of Portsmouth negotiated peace with some, but not all, Native American groups. And as a result of this sort of incomplete peace, there was continued fighting. The Tuscarora and Yamasee Wars continued in the south, and there was significant and extended Mi'kmaq resistance in the north. In the aftermath of the war, Father Rail's War was one consequence of Queen Anne's War. This was a series of attacks against English settlements by the Mi'kmaq, led by a French priest known as Father Rail. There were continued resistance of Mi'kmaq and Acadians over the next few decades. In general, most Native participants were disenchanted after the war. The English tended to treat Native groups like conquered foes, despite the fact that so few Native groups actually signed a peace treaty. And you can imagine the puzzlement and anger of Native peoples who'd been fighting a war and left out of the settlement. As far as they were concerned, the war was still on. The French even had some difficulty with Native allies, given the fact that they lost so much territory in North America to the English. So this was a loss of face for the French, and they had to work very hard to re-cement some of these relationships. This brings to a close our look at the readings, videos, and topics from this week, week 9 of History 3190.